I understood that we looked at the history and traditions of the Constitution, at what the framers and the founders thought about. And when I drilled down to that level of analysis, it became clear to me that the framers themselves adopted the Equal Protection Clause, the 14th Amendment, the 15th Amendment in a race-conscious way, that they were in fact trying to ensure that people who had been discriminated against, the freedmen, during the Reconstruction period, were actually brought equal to everyone else in society. So I looked at the report that was submitted by the Joint Committee on Reconstruction, which drafted the 14th Amendment. And that report says that the entire point of the amendment was to secure rights of the freed former slaves. The legislator who introduced that amendment said that, quote, unless the Constitution should restrain them, those states will all, I fear, keep up this discrimination and crush to death the hated freedmen. That's not a race neutral or race blind idea in terms of the remedy. And even more than that, I don't think that the historical record establishes that the founders believed that race neutrality or race blindness was required, right? They drafted the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which specifically stated that citizens would have the same civil rights as enjoyed by white citizens. That's the point of that act, to make sure that the other citizens, the Black citizens, would have the same as the white citizens. So they recognized that there was unequal treatment, that people based on their race were being treated unequally. And importantly, when there was a concern that the Civil Rights Act wouldn't have a constitutional foundation, that's when the 14th Amendment came into play.
Child, a whole masterclass. We're getting a welcome back. That was the voice of Supreme Court Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson. Tyler Merritt is here and joining us. She created a whole new course, Africana Studies, Africana Legal Studies, looking at the law through the lens of Africana Studies. She is back. She is our legal expert here. And I want to talk about this with the great Professor Angi Porter. Hi, welcome back.
Thanks for having me back. Too kind those words.
Not true.
To be here with you, Karen.
Listen, I mean, thank you. And you created a framework because all of our laws, so Justice Jackson was responding to Samuel Alito, who basically, we should be looking at these through race neutral, racial blindness. And she was like, and Justice Sotomayor was like, he just gave away the game. He just gave away the game when he said that. So walk us through our laws, because we're a nation of laws, Professor Porter.
We are a nation of laws. But I want to start with what you said, Karen, if you don't mind, because that is when it gets dirty. When people use this language of neutrality, that there could even possibly be a race neutral anything in this country, is completely farcical. I mean, there's no one center, there's no one objective center, there are only multiple centers. And so when they reference this race neutral map, and I'll get to what the controversy is in a second, but at the center lies a redistricting map. When they kept saying that there's a race neutral map, it makes no sense. There's no race neutrality. Also, that map, that map was straight discriminatory. It was straight racist, but there is no neutrality. This is how whiteness hides in the law and in other aspects of this country's culture. It hides behind this myth of objectivity. When it has an agenda, and its agenda is about race, it's about racial dominance and maintaining racial, read white, power in this country.
So when someone says white lives matter, it is equally offensive, because that's all that has mattered since the inception of this country. So to say that.
It's doubly, you're now layering another layer of the invisible, the silent whiteness that's there. Dr. Greg Carr, who you talk to every week on In Class with Carr, he teaches a lot about this in his classes, this invisibility of whiteness in language. And he's riffing on Clyde Taylor, but saying essentially that whiteness gets to hide. There's only Santa Claus. There's not white Santa Claus. There's only Jesus. There's not white Jesus. The white is implied. I think one of the Congress, what was that, Lindsey Graham or who was it, who said Americans and black people. There's Americans and there's black people. Well, Americans means white Americans. So the whole idea of whiteness gets to hide, including in phrases like neutrality, race neutral maps. What they're really saying is this is the map that benefits white voters. So it's not race neutral.
All right,
So.
866-801-8255. There is the Supreme Court started hearing cases. This controversy, and I don't think it's controversial at all, came about because of this gerrymandering case. Yeah. Is it North Carolina?
This is Alabama.
Alabama. Break down this case that made it to the Supreme Court, and those of you who are listening, you know, Ketanji Brown Jackson doesn't have the numbers, but she has the moral authority. I feel like, you know, this case is probably going to be decided against anything that's just, you know, justified or sane. But, you know, what she laid out, I think, was super important. But tell us about this case and why should we care? Yeah.
So at issue in this case, there are two levels, two things at issue. One is the redistricting scheme of Alabama, and therefore the voter power, the power of Black voters in Alabama is at issue. On the second layer is the Voting Rights Act is at issue. The Voting Rights Act of 1965, which is an enforcing congressional law that enforces the 15th Amendment. So the reason Justice Jackson is talking about the Reconstruction era is because the Voting Rights Act is enabled by the 15th Amendment, which prohibits the denial of the right to vote to anyone based on race and based on prior condition of servitude. So we know who we're talking about. It's Black America. Mm-hmm. So every 10 years, there's a census. After the census, states redraw their maps because, you know, civics lesson, quick civics lesson, one of the houses of Congress and also usually one of the chambers of state Congress or state congressional houses, one of those chambers is based on population. So after every census, we have to redraw maps in the states. Who gets to redraw the maps? The legislature, ironically. So the legislature in Alabama in 2021, after the 2020 census, and remember how fraught the 2020 census was? They were trying to get people to not participate.
Yeah, it was a mess.
It was a huge mess, but it happened. We got there. Alabama's redrawing its maps. Normal thing. Not normal, problematic thing is they drew a map that looked just like all the maps before. And this map has one district of 7 that has a majority Black population. Problem, Alabama has a population that is about 30% Black. So they get in one of 7 districts.
They pushed all the Black people into one district.
Yeah, one of 7. And so looking at this new map, some voters in the state and then the state conference of the NAACP got together and sued and said, hey, this map violates the Voting Rights Act, which prohibits discrimination in voting practices. So they're like, we need 2 districts. We need 2 of the 7 districts to be majority Black so that Black voters actually have some power according to their population in this state. The federal judges who heard that case, so every state has federal courts and it's a federal law we're talking about, the VRA, so it goes to federal court. There's a panel of 3 judges to decide this case, and they looked at it like, hey, this is open and shut. This is an easy case because we know the VRA and what it requires. We're looking at Alabama's map. It looks discriminatory. Fun fact, 2 of those 3 judges were Trump appointees. So even the Trump judges said, it's an easy case. Racist map, They ordered the Alabama legislature to redraw the map. You have 2 weeks, Alabama, redraw the map, make it make sense racially, because right now it's discriminatory. Well, Alabama, and this case is called Merrill versus Milligan. John Merrill is the state attorney general for Alabama. So Alabama cried foul. They went to the Supreme Court. John Merrill and them went to the Supreme Court on the shadow docket, which is the emergency docket of the Supreme Court, and said, hey, they're trying to tell us we need to draw a new map. We don't want to. And so the Supreme Court, this was back in February. I think you and I might have even talked about this, Karen, but the Supreme Court said, we'll decide the ultimate issues later, but for now, stick with the original map, the original racist map. Stick with the original map and we'll hear it later. And so now here we are in October and the court is hearing it. Now, a layer of damage has already been done because they stuck with the original racist map for the primaries. And this decision is not going to come out until after the election, the general election.
Wow.
So the 2022 election in Alabama is using a racist map. And so one level of victory for Alabama has already arrived. Now the question is, what will this decision do to the VRA, which the Supreme Court has already been hostile to, has already gutted in many ways, if you've heard of the case called Shelby County versus Holder that happened in 2013. I'm happy to talk about any of that, but I'll stop for now. That's just the overview of the case and where we are. And this is why we had oral argument yesterday.
Roll Tide, Tyler, roll Tide.
And you know what? I knew you were about to just, I knew that was coming. But you know, hey, I almost said when you were about to go into Alabama and go in the Supreme Court, I was like, Alabama is about to Alabama.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? No one's surprised by this.
No one's surprised by this, including the justices. I mean, if you got a chance to listen to some more of that argument, Sotomayor, Kagan, Jackson, they were all nonplussed. They were like, we know what's going on in Alabama. There have been several what are called amicus briefs filed in this case. That's where interested parties who are not actually in the lawsuit get to write briefs and talk about what's at stake. Many briefs have come in and said the reality that you just said, Tyler, which is Alabama has been racist from jump and is still racist. One of the favorite briefs of mine that I read was written by U.W. Clemon, a Black federal judge in Alabama, and Fred Gray, a legendary civil rights attorney. And they explained that in recent years, Alabama legislators, white legislators, referred to the Black voting population as Aborigines in Alabama. So these are recent events. And they talked about how it's a hostile environment for Black representatives in the Alabama State House. So they know the reality on the ground. Here's the real insidious part of this case, which is they're trying to change the way the court looks at the VRA. So the court could do a couple things with its supermajority of conservative justices. They could outright get rid of the Voting Rights Act, but they've wisened up, especially after the Dobbs decision. And Chief Justice Roberts' style is to stab you without you seeing the knife. So they will likely not outright get rid of the Voting Rights Act. They will probably make it ineffective. They'll disable it and people won't even know unless they follow this case. And one way they can disable it is by listening to the arguments that were presented yesterday by the state of Alabama. State of Alabama said they're trying to raise the hurdle for people who challenge voting maps. Historically, they used to say you had to prove discriminatory intent to show that a map was illegal or violated the VRA. The Supreme Court said that in the 80s. And Congress said, no, you are interpreting this act wrong. we are not going to require people to prove discriminatory intent, which is really hard to prove because racism acts in disguise. People don't just outright say things, they are slick with it. So proving discriminatory intent is too high a burden. Congress said, no, they need to just show discriminatory results, discriminatory effect, i.e. they need to show the reality on the ground is Black voters don't have power. And that's easier to show. It's still a big burden, but it's easier. So anyway, they're trying to go backwards and raise the requirement, and that will really hurt the VRA.
Will you stick around, Professor Porter? Because I want to give an action item. We can't just talk about the problem without talking about the solution. So when we come back, in the election in Alabama, you got the Attorney General, the Secretary of State, super important. The state's treasurer is running unopposed, as well as the state auditor, people who give out the money, unopposed, agriculture, unopposed, Republican. Republican is an apartheid state. What can people do? Of course, we have a Senate race, we have a governor's race, but there's a lot of local elections, including school board, and it is disproportionately Republican, which means white in Alabama, for the 30+% Black people, one of the largest states that have Black people in our union. All right, action items. You're in Alabama. People and a lot of people in Alabama. Alabama is an amazing state. You know, Tyler loves Alabama. I love the people who live in Alabama who, since Reconstruction ended, stayed because a lot of folk left. They ended up in St. Louis. They ended up in Chicago. They ended up in, places north, Detroit, to find a better life. But the people that stayed should be given a warm hug, because don't give up that land. Don't give up anything. But now we need our rights. Yeah. So empower us, Angie. Professor Porter.
You call me Angie.
I know I can, but the people need to call you Professor. Okay, Professor Porter. Empower the people in Alabama right now. What can they do? There are a lot of people being on the ballot. I'm looking at Kate Ivy's ass. I'm like, wow, come on, y'all.
Well, my grandmother's from Alabama, so it's near and dear to my heart. My great aunts and uncles are from there. My great grandparents, a lot of ancestors from there. But what can people in Alabama do? Well, this is a question for them and also for the rest of us, because this case, like I said, has those multiple layers. But I think one of the biggest things is in the discourse. A lot of us are on social media. A lot of us are talking to one another. We're talking to our families. We're talking to young people in community. Reject this notion outright that race neutral anything is good. And reject this notion that throwing history to the wind is in any way permissible. I mean, that has to be a main thrust in our conversations, because it's so absurd. How can you address racism without talking about race? You can't. So we have to make that plain in our day-to-day conversations, because we are in this sort of culture war. It's on social media, it's on YouTube, it's in the shows people are watching. The fact that that's even a question should not be tolerated. And in order for us to really make that statement confidently and clearly, we have to continue studying history. So if you're in Alabama or in any of these states where they're suppressing discourse around history, that's going to be harder. And so connecting with folks around the country and around the world is absolutely critical, so that you can access your own history. So you know what they're doing. You see the knife they're trying to stick in us before it's happening, and certainly as it's happening. So that will help in these conversations. Know this case, study this case. The parties to this case represent organizations in Alabama and organizations that have sister organizations around the country. So if you're feeling helpless and looking for what to do, you can look at this case, in fact, and see, based on who's involved, hey, I want to help them. I want to be involved in that to make sure this doesn't happen again or get any worse. And then for all of us around the country, Black people, we have to vote. We really have to vote. They may be diluting the vote in certain places. They absolutely are. But in the places where that's not happening, if they're going to dilute the vote, we need to supercharge our vote. and make sure that we maintain some say in these state legislatures, because they have a lot of power. If there's no other takeaway from this case that you take with you, it's that the state legislatures have tremendous power, even for the federal election. So if they made you think that the only election that counts is the federal election, that is a lie. And it's an insidious lie, and it's meant to maintain white dominance in this country. There are a couple other cases coming up that have more to do with that, and maybe we'll talk again about those cases. We have the affirmative action cases coming up too. That argument is on Halloween. So let's just be.
They're crafty. You know, as you're, yes. Yeah. Professor Porter, Tyler Merritt is here, of course, as well. You know, as you were talking about gerrymandering, it really only matters for the local elections, right? I mean, because statewide elections, the governor's race, it's about the total numbers. The Senate, the same thing. They're not sending people to the Senate based on districts, right? So the redistricting, it tells you how important the local elections are, because the map is really about the state legislation.
Actually, Karen, I'm going to tweak that a little bit. So yes, those maps are about the state elections. The state legislature draws the state districting maps for congressional elections, U.S. Congress.
For the state for the representatives.
That go, for the House.
For the House, okay.
House.
Okay, so this is nasty. Okay, so it doesn't affect the Senate. It doesn't affect the governor.
No.
It affects the congressional members.
So
that means there's only going to be one Black representative for the entire state, for the U.S. House of Representatives.
You got it. You got it.
Okay, thank you. This is so important. This is so important. Okay, but it won't impact this. It's too late, right? For now.
It's too late for Alabama for now. But what could happen, and actually the Solicitor General made an argument yesterday, and that she represents the Biden administration, essentially. They talk about what could happen if this case goes wrong, and it has national implications. Because if they tamper with the way we look at the VRA, and they make it harder for people to challenge these maps that state legislatures make that draw districts for congressional elections, House of Representatives, that means other states, and you know which states I'm talking about, they will use that as their cue. That will be their
because it's a precedence now.
Yep, the Supreme Court creates precedent that applies to all the states. So they will take that as their cue to get rid of majority minority districts, majority Black or other minority districts, without any explanation. And they can hide behind anything they want to and not be challenged, because they will require a higher burden of showing discriminatory intent. And folk know how to get around that. They would just secretively change these districts and point to some pretext, some excuse that people can't prove otherwise. And that's what will happen. So this has potential dire consequences for other locales.
I want to take all of this for a second and put it into a tangible, breathable, touchable thing for listeners. Now, in my book, I talk about Alabama a lot because my mother and father are from Utah, Alabama, EUTAW, and I love putting them on the map, right? But this is what I know about Utah. When I drive to go and visit them, I go off a little bit of exit into what I call a little tiny Black town. My mom now owns the country store there that was always owned by white people. My mom and dad own 3 houses in that little community, so she's giving back. But these are individuals in this town that their everyday life is just surviving. Their everyday life is doing the normal things that they do. And here's the reality. As much as all the words that we're using right now on the actual ground, and I'm not saying in all of Alabama, but in this tiny Black town of Utah, Alabama, these incredible Black people for years and years and years are living their lives and surviving and living the way in which they were raised and grown and birthed. But what they aren't doing is they aren't taking into consideration that while they are living, struggling, succeeding, there are individuals that are actually working against them in real time, that are doing the actual work to draw lines of separation so that their vote matters less in places. And these aren't things that are at the front of their mind because they have now just been in the rat wheel of just trying to live their life every day. But I think what is important, especially for listeners to hear, is that as you are walking through your everyday life, just trying to exist, know that there are individuals that are hard at work to try to make your everyday life count less. So it means something. It makes a difference for you to stop where you are for a second, to look around, look at your children growing up, look at your parents above you, and say, what can I do in this moment to make a difference? And this is where, Professor Porter, your words matter so much. You're just not just speaking on a broad thing of like, let me educate you. You are saying it's important that you know this in your everyday life so that you can get out of that rat race and take some actual action. Though it may be difficult, it's necessary.
Yeah.
Amen.
Yeah. And those, I mean, we have to work as a collective. Some of us are fortunate not to have to struggle just to survive every day, like the folks you're talking about in Alabama. I mean, my grandmother's from Demopolis, Alabama, which is a tiny town in that Black Belt region. We have to be the ones, if we have that time and energy to pay attention and to understand what's going on, you know, each election, we got connections. We're all but 1-2 people away from this. So you could call your grandmother and say, hey, are you voting? What do you need? Call your cousin, let them know. They might have obligations and day-to-day things. Just send that message. I mean, we have to work as a collective here. It's incumbent upon us, in fact, to do that. We have a responsibility to do that for our people.